We turn now to discussion of two albums that are essentially the same album with some relatively minor differences, and an EP that are released in the first half of 1965. The album in America, known as the Rolling Stones Now, is released in February of '65, going to number 5 in the US charts. Almost the same album is released as the Rolling Stones number 2 in the UK in January of '65, and that one goes to number 1 in the UK charts. And just to remind you, I know I've said this a number of times during the course of discussing this, but this is the third American album, but only the second British album. Remember, because 12 by 5, the second American album, was never released in the UK because they'd released an EP called 5 by 5. And also remember that for those of us on this side of the pond, or the American side of the pond anyway, these EPs played hardly any role in the way that we think about rock music because they just weren't a format that ever sold very well here. So to a certain extent, that difference, we get off in terms of numbering the albums between the two countries by 1 because of the presence of that EP in the UK. Anyway, when we look at this record, produced by Andrew Oldham and recorded in 3 different locations in the RCA studios now in Hollywood, engineered by a guy called Dave Hassinger. Now, Dave Hassinger starts to become an important kind of a guy in the way in which the Rolling Stones are recording up a lot of their music. They really like they really like the studio in LA and are going to end up coming back there an awful lot. And then later in their career, wherever they record around the globe, they'll come back to LA to do the last overdubs and mix the record. So LA at this point in November of 1964, so just coming into '65, when they're on that, in fact, when they're on that second US tour, is when they stop in RCA. There's a story of them being picked up at the airport by Sonny Bono, who at that point was not yet thought of as half of Sonny and Cher, but was just Phil Spector's kind of right-hand man. And of course, they had, Andrew Loog Oldham had the experience with Phil Spector and all this. There was already a friendship there. They go to these RCA studios. The RCA studios are probably most famous in the history of rock music because of the studios where Elvis Presley recorded a lot of the music when he was in California doing those movies in the first half of the 1960s. So for the Stones, you know, they'd already been to the Chess Studios. Now they were going to be in the studios where Elvis Presley had recorded. Not sure if it's exactly the same room, the recording room there, or not. But you know, Elvis had recorded there. That's pretty awesome if you're a rock and roll fanatic. So some of these recordings come from the RCA studios from these November '64 sessions. Some of them are recorded in Regent Sound, their favorite locale for recording in London, at this point engineered by Bill Farley. Those recordings come from September of '64, though there's one that dates all the way back to January of '64. They get that track that was unused from before and bring it back. And then yet more stuff from Chess Studios, engineered by Ron Melo. More stuff from that June session that they did on the first American tour. And then they stopped in again during the second American tour of November '64 and recorded some more stuff. So here's the way I want to think about Rolling Stones number 2 / the Rolling Stones Now. I want to think about it as all really one big album. Some of the stuff, most of the stuff was recorded, and most of the stuff was on both versions. And we'll just talk about the deviations, but instead of thinking of them as 2 different records, let's think of them all taken together as all kind of one big album. So if we do that, and if we kind of, pull everything together, here's what we find. As I said, tracks between the UK and the US albums differ. 7 are the same, 5 are different. So that makes, when you get the 5 that are different, 5 plus 5 plus the 7 that are the same, that makes 17 songs overall that we're going to take account of here as we talk about this album from the early 1965. So there are 4 originals on this record. So more and more originals on the album. So we went from 1 to 3 to 4 here with this third American studio album, and 13 covers. We'll go through the covers, and this week I really want to, at the end of the week, end of the videos, I want to try to make some kind of generalization about what we can really learn from all these cover versions that the Rolling Stones did. What do these cover versions tell us? I just remarked that these were recorded in 3 different studios. So we have Hollywood recordings, Chicago recordings, and London recordings, as I said before, released in the UK in January and in the US in February. When we look at the cover art, because we've been paying a little bit of attention to that, David Bailey once again takes the photos for both of these albums, the Rolling Stones Now and Number 2. Remember, he was the fashion photographer who was a friend of Mick's, who'd done the picture for 12 by 5. And there are lengthy and fanciful liner notes by Andrew Loog Oldham. These are probably the most lengthy liner notes he ever did, and I call them fanciful because I like Andrew Loog Oldham, and I think he's an imaginative character. Some people might call these liner notes a little loopy. They almost seem like a kind of an anticipation of psychedelia, like psychedelia without the drugs. Anyway, I'll leave it to you to look those up and see what you think of them. But again, we're seeing the same pattern of, thinking very carefully about what the cover art looks like and then marketing the group through the liner notes. We talked about that last week. So let's talk first about, we said there are 4 originals and 13 covers. So let's talk about the original songs that are on these 2 records. What a Shame appears on both albums. For Grown Up Wrong is on Number 2 only, but it had been on 12 by 5, right, released in November of 1964. Then we have Heart of Stone, which was on the American version only, but it will appear on the UK version of Out of Our Heads, which we'll get to in a future video here this week. And then Surprise, Surprise, that song is on the American version only. So out of those Jagger Richards tunes, that's kind of how they lay out. Now the cover versions that are on both albums, so of the 13 covers, we have 6 covers that are on both albums and 7 covers that differ. So here are the 6 that are on both albums. There's a Solomon Burke tune called Everybody Needs Someone to Love, Alvin Robinson, Down Home Girl, Chuck Berry, You Can't Catch Me, Chuck Berry, Down the Road a Piece, that Off the Hook track that we talked about that's not really a cover of the Little Walter song, but they had to come to some kind of legal agreement with Chess because of their Off the Wall single that Little Walter had done. And the 6th one being Pain in My Heart, Otis Redding. So what are we seeing here? More Chuck Berry. Boy, they love Chuck Berry, but more Solomon Burke as well. Otis Redding, Solomon Burke, Chuck Berry, real favorites with the Rolling Stones in these cover versions. Well, what about the ones that were separately on the US and on the UK side? Well, Mona, I Need You Baby was on the US album, but it had been on the Rolling Stones' first album in the UK. Right, so there was one they hadn't used in the US yet, so they bring it on here for the US album. Little Red Rooster, their Howlin' Wolf cover. Now that one had been a single in the UK, remember, just a couple of months earlier, and so now they bring it onto the US album and make some use of it. And then Oh Baby, We Got a Good Thing Going, a Barbara Lynn tune, or her full name Barbara Lynn Ozen. It appears on the American version only, but it will appear on the UK version of Out of Our Heads. I know it's a little bit complicated, but the idea is they end up using up almost all of the material so that at some point everything's released in both countries. Not entirely, but almost. What about the stuff that was only in the UK? Under the Boardwalk was released on the UK version because it was on 12 by 5, and of course 12 by 5 wasn't released in the UK, so there's one they were able to use up. Susie Q, the Dale Hawkins cover that had been on 12 by 5, also appears on the UK version, Rolling Stones Number 2, and I Can't Be Satisfied, a Muddy Waters tune, appears on the UK version. I think one thing that we should really note here as we talk about this album, the Rolling Stones Now album, is that these November 1964 sessions mark a real beginning in the RCA studios, and I talked about that just a couple of moments ago. But they also mark the beginning of the band's relationship with Jack Nietzsche. I'm going to say his name Nietzsche. He may pronounce it Nietzsche. Nietzsche is following the German philosopher. Jack Nietzsche played piano. He was a kind of sort of another Phil Spector acolyte. They say acolyte. He was he was part of the Phil Spector circle. Knew a lot of people in town. Was a real LA studio guy, and he became sort of an active participant in those Rolling Stones recordings in LA. So much so that when they stopped recording in LA, they would fly Jack Nietzsche to the sessions so he could be with them in London. They depended a lot on his ability to sort of help them shape the music. So this is where that relationship begins, the relationship with our RCA studio, with Dave Hassinger when they're in that RCA studio, and with Jack Nietzsche both when they're in LA and when they're in London a little bit later. As we finish out this video, I just want to say a couple of real quick words about an EP that was released in the UK only. It's called Got Live If You Want It. And keep an eye on this title, because the title Got Live If You Want It will be used in 1966 for a live album that's got almost entirely different contents and is released in the US. So when you say Got Live When You Want It EP, you mean the UK one that's released in 65. Got Live If You Want It LP, that's the American record that's released in 1966, and they only have, I think, one song in common between the two of them. Anyway, so just keep your eye on that, and don't be confused between the two. This one, the EP, was recorded live on tour in the UK in March of 1965, and though the recording is raw, it gives a useful picture of the band's sound live. The story that you often read is that the engineer, Glyn Johns, simply put, a couple of microphones up in the balcony and just recorded what he got. But when you listen to the recording, he may have had mics in the balcony, but you can tell that there are other mics that are pretty close to the singer's mouths, because you're not hearing the singing coming through some gigantic PA or even a small PA reverberating through a big room. But however it is that Glyn Johns did that, the recordings are not really very good. And the Rolling Stones didn't like the record very much and didn't really even consider that one, or even the second one that came out that I was talking about, the American one from the next year. They didn't consider really either one of them to be live albums of the band. They figured their first live album was Get Your Ya-Ya's out from 1970. But anyway, these are great sort of early documents. It's also important to point out that Glyn Johns will become very important as an engineer when the band starts recording in Olympic Studios in London. And he was actually one of the first guys to record the Rolling Stones at IBC Studios in London. In fact, he actually had signed a kind of a deal with the Rolling Stones to record them, and they had to kind of a little bit trick Glyn Johns to release them from that deal so they could sign with Andrew Loog Oldham and Eric Easton, and so then Easton and Loog Oldham could sign them to Decca. So Brian Jones was elected to go in and say the band had broken up, so could they be let out of the contract? And Glyn said, "Oh, that's too bad. I'm so sorry. Of course, here." Signed it off in a way, and then they went right back to Eric Easton and Andrew Loog Oldham, and off they went to Decca and signed them. So anyway, Glyn Johns comes back into the picture along with his brother Andy Johns. Anyway, Got Live If You Want It, the EP, released in June of 1965 in the UK only, goes to #1 on the UK charts. It contains 5 tracks, of which 3 were previously unreleased, at least up to this point. Everybody Needs Somebody, Pain in My Heart, and Route 66. I should say it contains 5 tracks, of which 3 were previously released. Sorry, there's a correction there. Everybody Needs Somebody to Love, Pain in My Heart, and Route 66 had all appeared on earlier records. And they do a cover of Hank Snow's I'm Moving On, a country and western singer. They're doing a cover of I'm Moving On. That's going to be important. We get to the end of this week and we talk about influences, because this country influence thing, sometimes maybe a little bit overlooked in the earlier music. It becomes pretty apparent later in the Stones' music, but now we can see the country music there from these very early days. And the fifth of those is a song called I'm All Right. It is attributed to Nanker Felge, but there's some speculation that it's based on a Bo Diddley song. I can't tell you that for sure. So that gives us a picture of what was happening with these 2 versions of the same album in the first half of 1965, in the summer of 65, the release of this EP, Got Live If You Want It. In the next video, I want to take a close look at 3 Rolling Stones songs from the first, Jagger Richards songs actually, from the first half of 1965, As Tears Go By, Heart of Stone, and The Last Time.